Hi, thank you very much, Paul, and good afternoon, everybody. Roland Rich from the United Nations Office for Partnerships, and I was going to raise an issue that I raised 5 years ago in a paper I wrote for a think tank, which I gave a few interviews about and appeared before an Australian parliamentary committee, and I can honestly say that nobody liked this idea. So I let it go, but I'm going to resurrect it today and just see what the feedback is. So let me first describe the problem. The problem is that we have spent $3 trillion on official development assistance in half a century, and we are not seeing the dividends. That's the problem. It's a well-known problem. And William Easterly, I think, has written widely on this issue. Why? What is the heart of the problem? My answer is one word: sovereignty. Sovereignty is the problem. If we think of the issue as donor country A, just to simplify, donor country A, recipient country B, large bottles with narrow little spouts, the ODA process is by putting the two spouts together. It's all the government-to-government stuff. And my idea is let's have some more ways of having these interactions, citizen to citizen, corporation to corporation, NGO to NGO, not going through government channels, not respecting the sovereignty Westphalian ideas that are so prevalent and frankly are not working. But it's still official development assistance. So where's the official element of it? And we still need to count and track and so forth. And here is really the idea, and that is that where we have individuals and corporations and so forth providing ODA-like assistance to countries in the global south, they can claim that as a tax deduction. The money never enters the public money domain. It's always at the private level, but you claim the amount that you've provided as development assistance in your various ways as a tax deduction. That means that the flow to the global south will be much higher than the tax foregone. If a tax regime is, just for simplicity's sake, 33%, then twice that amount will flow in aid flows than the amount that will be claimed as ODA. And I can understand why people didn't like it, because it challenged a whole range of industries and bureaucracies that survive on this $3 trillion flow that we've had of ODA. But frankly, if we just keep doing exactly the same that we've been doing in the past and it's not working, then we will fail. So that was the idea I had then. It's the idea I throw out again, and let's see if anybody likes it, Paul.
Thank you. Julius.
Thank you. My name is Julius Akinyemi from MIT Media Lab. You probably wonder where the Media Lab and social entrepreneurship. Actually, my mission at the Media Lab is focused on that. So I kind of agree partially with what Roland just mentioned, but I have a little more concern. I think, and thank you so much for that figure, $3 trillion. That's a huge amount of money. And my belief is when you give and there's cash involved and everything of that nature, it's great, it's quite commendable, but it's not sustainable, which is why we are where we are today. So for that reason, there has to be a change in the business model. There has to be accountability. There has to be a way, I think, far deeper than just the sovereign nature. I agree with you that that's one of the problems. But I think the biggest problem is lack of accountability and a system that needs to change where we can draw a balance sheet, we can draw a profitability for social entrepreneurship. So, what do I mean by that? Well, let's think about creating a social digital currency. So at any point in time, we can draw a currency that says, okay, here is the profitability of what UN gave to Nigeria or whatever it may be, okay? As opposed to where we gave the money, goes through government, to your point, and the money never got to where it's going, and we never see the end of it. So accountability has to be there, And the whole notion of giving without responsibility and sustainability has to be eradicated in my mind. People have to understand that when you run a social entrepreneurship doesn't necessarily mean that everything is given away with no responsibility and no accountability. So I'm sure you will have a lot more questions on that. So let me just stop there, because we can discuss this extensively, and I'd be delighted to talk about how we can create a social currency and draw balance sheet at any point in time. Businesses do it, and that's why businesses thrive. So if we start doing it for social entrepreneurship, I'm absolutely confident that we will have some progress more than what we have today.
Thank you. Gary.
My name is Gary Schwartz. I'm the Vice President at Tides, public charity, social enterprise, housed primarily in San Francisco in the Presidio, also here in New York. I was going to talk a little bit about the different business lines of work that we do at Tides. If you're not used to spending time on the right side of your brain, that's really my work and what I do. So I ask some of you who've spent most of your time on the left side to join me on the right. Ostensibly, I'm a poet by training. So as I talk about the work that I do and I talk about social enterprise, I'll just say that I bring a different spin on how I look at this work, as well as how I think the majority of people look at this work. The three different business lines that we work on, one is real estate. We develop green nonprofit tenant centers around the United States, LEED certified nonprofit centers. We were involved in the conversion of the military base in the Presidio over to a nonprofit tenant center. We also converted the JP Morgan offices downtown into Tides Foundation. So you can imagine the karma train related to that work that we do. That's part of what we do around the country is we work with nonprofit organizations that are about LEED certified green spaces. We work in donor-advised giving. We do approximately $200 million a year in transactions to nonprofit organizations, social enterprises, and other kinds of entities. And we also do fiscal sponsorship of organizations, people, and ideas, and practitioners of different kinds of work throughout the globe. I'm going to kind of focus on about 5 or 6 different areas, and I'll just briefly touch on them. I'm going to talk about the U.S. emphasis in this country on philanthropy, particularly on what I call hero philanthropy, in the same way that I think we approach social entrepreneurism. It's quite different in the rest of the world. I'm going to talk a little bit eventually about chasing philanthropic capital, which a lot of people are very preoccupied with, some global trends in philanthropy that I see happening. Going to talk about investing in women and girls, because that's primarily what my work is about, including the next 7 generations in all of your thinking when you think about investment capital as well as philanthropic dollars. And finally, I'm going to talk about investing in the new majority, which in this country is primarily people of color, as well as LGBT folks around capital. A good part of our work more recently is about working with philanthropic leaders who fall into that category that we at Tides call the new majority. So I'll stop there.
Nancy.
Good morning, good afternoon, everyone, and thanks to the Blue Wind Foundation staff for having us here. And it's just been a great 2 days. I am the founder of a double bottom line venture capital firm headquartered in San Francisco. And by double bottom line, what we mean is that we invest for both top tier financial return, but also for social return, which could take environmental improvement, the form of environmental improvement or job creation or community engagement. A lot of different ways we play that out. And the reason we do this is because we see just an enormous opportunity to unleash much more innovation that accomplishes both economic gain and social change, positive social change. And what we have been able to prove, we now have 2 funds under management, is that by investing wisely, using the tools of finance that our firm, that our members have developed through their careers, and layering on a social framework, you can do two things. The first is you can scale the efforts of philanthropy far beyond the capacity in terms of making an impact. One company we have called Revolution Foods started out serving healthy lunches to low-income school children in one school in Oakland, California. Now we serve over 160,000 meals a day, and we are a for-profit. We're growing. We're getting national attention and solving a huge social need in terms of obesity rates and diabetes in young people, especially lower income children. And no foundation could ever afford to do that. You need the power of the private sector. You need entrepreneurship to really build at scale and address such a pervasive problem which exists in our country. Another example of how we do that is through Tesla Motors, which was another one of our early investments, which is an electric car company that builds cars that go really fast and are quite beautiful and run on batteries as opposed to fossil fuel. And there again, you can have all of the researchers in universities building the technology that companies will use to implement a radical change, a radical shift from fossil to electric vehicles, but without the private sector to take the risk, to build the alliances, to really scale the technical research, you're not going to really make a difference, in this case, in the carbon footprint of transportation in our world. And with the private sector viewing its mission as more than just to make money for investors, but really to have an impact on our planet, you're able to capture that entrepreneurial zeal, the kind of energy and expertise that builds the legends that we now have in Silicon Valley, now expanded to include climate change. So those are some examples in terms of how what we do, one of the reasons we do it is because we're able to scale the efforts of many not-for-profits and governments toward meaningful change in a lot of different areas. The second thing is, the second reason why we do what we do is because the power of innovation in our country, the entrepreneurship that has been unleashed, that has transformed our world, from the devices we use to the food we eat to the way we live our lives, is powerful. And if we can get entrepreneurs to view their mission as not only coming up with the next iPad or the next communication device or whatever it is, but also to have a social thread to that, there's no stopping us. And in fact, that's what we have found working with entrepreneurs, is that when given the chance to invent something, a gadget that's really useful, but also to have a social purpose, they raise their hand and want to do both. It's just they need help. It's difficult enough to have a successful company, let alone have a double impact. One example of a company we worked with on that score is Pandora, the digital music service that I'm sure many of you enjoy using. Lots of trials and tribulations from when we invested when they had less than 2 million listeners to today when they're over 55 million listeners. But from the get-go, they wanted music to make a difference in people's lives, especially in education and in those that didn't always have access to the latest technology. And so they put a community engagement component into their work very early on that has enriched not only the lives of people in Oakland, where they're headquartered, but has added a whole new way of looking at their business opportunity, and is part of the reason they're thriving and growing. So scaling not-for-profit social change and expanding the mission of these very powerful entrepreneurs that so many of our children want to grow up being, capturing that entrepreneurial zeal and expanding it to include social accomplishment. That's what our investment philosophy is, and at the same time, you do that when you get investors from pension funds or foundations or family offices, you help to spread the word that this is capable, and as a result, we see a whole new format for investment that merges financial accomplishment with philanthropic goals.
Leila.
Hi there, I'm Lila Jana. I'm the founder and CEO of a social business called SamaSource. Sama means equal in Sanskrit. And we've invented a model called microwork, which involves breaking down big digital projects that would typically be outsourced to outsourcing firms in India and the Philippines into very small tasks, and then farming those tasks out to a network of partners located in some of the poorest regions in the world, in rural South Asia, East Africa, and Haiti, where we have trained women and youth to do this work. So we have now paid and trained over 3,000 women and youth to do work for companies like eBay, LinkedIn, Google, Walmart.com, and some of the biggest technology firms in the world. So we use the analogy with microfinance. We say that microwork is to outsourcing what microfinance is to banking. We figured out a way to break down this traditional industry and make it more accessible to the poor. And we've also figured out a way to do it sustainably. I won't say profitably yet. We're about 50% funded through sales, through earned income, but we're growing that very rapidly. And I'm, in fact, inspired by many of the companies in Nancy's portfolio. I have to say, it's funny that I always meet great social entrepreneurs from the Bay Area when I'm in New York. So this is typical. But I remember hearing from Revolution Foods back in 2008 at a summit for impact investing in the Bay Area. So a lot of these kinds of models start off as nonprofits. They're able to prove the model, and then they can attract scaling capital once they've shown investors that they can actually generate modest return. I also joined the board of CARE yesterday. CARE is one of the oldest and largest development institutions in the world, and I'm really interested in this question of scale in a nonprofit context. We have a few examples in the nonprofit world of organizations like BRAC and like CARE that have scaled to impact hundreds of millions of people purely through a nonprofit model. But even within these organizations, we're starting to realize that we need to find new ways to generate revenue from activities. Otherwise, the viability of the organizations is really questionable right now. So I'm excited to talk a little bit more about scale. And I wanted to address a couple of issues just now, which really get me interested in the social enterprise model. The first is the whole reason that I entered this space. So I studied international development. I worked briefly at the World Bank. I worked for some big development institutions. And I got really frustrated by what I saw as broken feedback loops. So the nice thing about the private sector is you've got this great unifying force, which is this profit motive, and you've got a great way to measure success, which is dollars. So if you're producing a crappy product, consumers won't buy it and the business will go out of business. But in the aid world, you could well be producing a crappy intervention, forcing it on poor people, and you really have no way of knowing whether it's successful and whether those people really appreciate the intervention and it's making a difference. And it's incredibly hard to measure social impact, as I'm sure Aishwarya will tell us. IPA has done some great work there, but it's really tricky. And so without this universal form of feedback, how do you really understand whether your intervention is making people's lives better or worse? And further to that, how do you disambiguate between all these different kinds of impact that you might be looking for, between environmental impact and social impact, whatever that means? So I'm really interested in social enterprise because I think it has the power to break down that traditional challenge of having poor feedback loops. When your money comes from the people that you're trying to help, there's just a much greater likelihood that you're giving them something valuable. The second question that I'm really interested in is this trade-off between profit, impact, and scale. And there's a lot more nuance to it than that. But we talk a lot about, at SamaSource, about impact as a factor of breadth and depth, right? So this is a really great way to think about it. It's impact equals breadth times depth times time. And what we've seen often is that we are ourselves as a business are faced with this trade-off of, do we help the poorer people? Do we go out and find the worse off women and youth, the people who really don't have the skills to do this work, and invest even more in training them? Or do we go after the people who are right at the cusp of the poverty line, who we know with just a tiny bit of training they could be helped and they could be bumped up? And it's a constant question that our sector addresses. I'm sure Revolution Foods has thought a lot about this. Probably the more local you source the food, the harder it is to scale. And so I hope that we get a chance to talk about some of those issues, because they're the things I face daily as an entrepreneur.
Wonderful. Thank you all for your comments. My name is Aishwarya, and I work as the director of a research initiative on financial services for the poor at Yale University in New Haven, close by. And I also work with Innovations for Poverty Action, IPA, which Laila mentioned. And IPA basically does randomized evaluations of development programs. And I'll say a little bit about what that methodology means. So I'll throw out a couple of ideas which I think might be complementary to what have been raised so far. So one of the questions that I initially thought about, first I was thinking about why am I on this panel, because I'm not an entrepreneur and I am not in the business of financing social enterprise either. But I believe I'm here to sort of provide a research perspective, which I will try and do, and also a perspective from the side of development, of what has been done in economic development maybe over the past 60 years specifically. So the first thing is, what is a social enterprise and why would it distinguish itself from a regular enterprise? There is the issue of what returns you look for, which we'll talk about a bit. But also all enterprise fundamentally, I just want to do a shout out to Adam Smith, and all enterprise and engagement in the market is supposed to be welfare enhancing. Otherwise, we would not be engaging that in such activity. So it depends on what we're measuring, right? If financial returns are what we're looking for as the metric, certainly, but otherwise the reason I work for Yale and hopefully you consume Pepsi or this tea is because it's adding some positive utility to your lived experience. So in that sense, I have a little more of a fuzzy line between what qualifies as a explicitly social mission-driven organization versus one that just accidentally does it. And a great example of this is, would you think of Vodacom as a social enterprise? Nokia, huge multi-million, billion-dollar companies who are doing what they do, but maybe in the process they create things which are powerful in making poor people's lives much more easy. And a great example of this is M-Pesa in Kenya, which was built a little on donor money, but then became a market force. The second thing is about measurement, because we're talking about social impact, separate from measuring financial returns. And social impact is difficult to measure, not just because of accountability issues, as Julius very rightly raised, and the aid business has certainly suffered from a lot of non-transparency, but I don't think that's unique to the aid business. I was just listening to the finance panel before this, and clearly there's a big issue with transparency and the availability of data for observation and analysis in the financial sector, which is many, many times the size of the aid business. So it's not unique to it, but what I would say is that there is an accountability and measurement problem just from a process perspective in terms of what data is collected. But there's also a problem from a scientific point of view. When you're thinking about the impact of a certain intervention on an outcome, in a lab setting, you can control everything else, so you can say that this particular thing that I did to the cell had this effect on this kind of cell. But the problem that we have in the real world is that there's no lab environment, nothing is controlled, so millions of variables are changing at the same time as you are performing your intervention, whose impact you want to measure. And at the same time, there are no cells that are identical. Every single human being comes with his or her behavioral and social and historical baggage, and in that you're trying to find an average impact. So what we're trying to do in the work that we do is to make this a little more rigorous. And my comment to Roland maybe would be that a part of it might be a sovereignty issue, but in my mind, a lot of it is a measurement issue as well. That there's been absolutely no science in the way we've done poverty alleviation for a long time. So part of it is to say, can we take the methodology that we've developed to do medical trials to field experiments? And this is to try and think about randomly assigning a particular treatment to two equivalent groups which can serve as controls for each other. So which can be perceived as being statistically equivalent on average. And then one of them gets the program, and one of them either doesn't get the program or gets a different version of the program. And then over time, in the short term and in the long term, you're measuring welfare indicators, right? And this is a very large-scale exercise because to get the numbers to balance two groups to give us equivalence statistically involves a lot of people and involves a lot of money. So these studies are hard to run. But I think it also requires a certain openness in terms of being willing to be self-critical. In terms of accepting the results of a rigorous evaluation. And I'll just make a final comment and wrap, just if you would. Very quickly. That my perspective on the panel is that I'm a little indifferent to where the money comes from. Certain things people can pay for themselves, as we do, but there are certain things which have massive positive externalities, which is what we choose to fund collectively through our taxes, education and healthcare. So maybe there's a role for different kinds of payment models.
Thank you. I think we've heard several themes emerging there, one of which is this question of scaling. Another one is accountability, and then obviously all the measurement issues that go around both of those. But as a way of sort of teasing out where we're going to go in the future on both those issues, I'd like to ask Roland, you mentioned at the beginning that when you sort of put these notions of social entrepreneurship up 10 years ago, whatever it was, they were rejected. At the time, I think it would be certainly true to say that there was a great deal of hostility between NGOs and business, which seems to be dissipating now, although not completely. Clearly, a lot of tensions between NGOs and governments, and also between business and governments. So what has changed? What has changed that has drawn business and entrepreneurs essentially into the development business? So what's the platform we've got now to grow on?
Well, you know, Paul, I think we are learning creatures. And we need to learn from what's happened in the past. And my criticism of ODA is it is so weak at learning from its mistakes. Corporations are much better at the learning process. And one of the things that corporations have learned is that the brand is the key to success. And you know, that wasn't the case 10 or 15 years ago when the only measurement was dividends. It's all about what can we give back to the shareholders was the only measurement. Now companies accept, no, if we build the brand, everything else will follow. And building the brand has become a very complicated issue. It's not just about profits, it's also about doing good. And that's why corporate social responsibility has become such a big issue, again, only in the last 5 or 10 years. So I think the corporate world is learning very fast. Governments learn very slowly in that regard. And to be quite honest, my proposal would hurt certain people, and the group that it would hurt most are the governments of the receiving countries. They would lose their monopoly as the recipients of aid. They would lose their clipguard corruption advantage that they currently have. They would lose their mediating role with their own people. And one of the things that really struck me about the panel that I appreciate so much, that in one way or another, everybody was talking about bottom-up empowerment. Not top-down Soviet 5-year planning, but bottom-up empowerment. Not linear, we don't know where it's all going to go, but let people control their lives, develop their own income streams and so forth. And I think we've got to try to facilitate that. We've got to try to facilitate bottom-up empowerment in all these different ways. And governments can help in that regard. But let's let go of this idea that we can plan everything from the top, we can look 10 years ahead, everything will fall into place. That's not the way the world works.
You know, and that's one of the great, high-speed communication, digital communication networks is one of the great enablers in that, because they are just no respecters of boundaries at all. So they're starting to make legal and national borders completely irrelevant. Nancy, from your perspective and the perspective of your investors, is that really what's happening here? It's just that companies want to embed trust and sustainability into their brand because that they now see as an essential driver of their bottom line? Or is it more complex than that? Is there another element at work, another dynamic at work?
Well, I think that's one dynamic, but it's much more complex when you're looking at the entrepreneurial psyche. Entrepreneurs want to change the world. They may want to get rich. They may want to be on the cover of Fortune magazine, but they really do have a psychology that says they can go up against very entrenched incumbents and knock them down and occupy the top of the hill. So what you're seeing over the past 10 years, and in part because we have had such a breakdown in a lot of our social systems and our economic safety net, is that entrepreneurs increasingly want to do more than just have a business success. They want to have an imprint just not only in Fortune, but in Time magazine or in something that is more inclusive of a social impact. And so that's why you're seeing many of these entrepreneurs that in the 90s and around the dot-com era would have just gone into a traditional tech company, now having a much more expansive view of what their opportunity is. And one of the examples is if you're a venture capitalist in the Bay Area, as I am, a lot of what you do is find talent. It's a big race to get the greatest people into your companies. And one company that's very hard to recruit from, no surprise, is Apple. I mean, if you worked at Apple, you have a pretty good job. I mean, it's a fantastic company, just a brain trust in terms of branding, technology, mobility, all of that. But if you look at, for example, a Tesla, Tesla has been able to hire out of Apple, and not just anyone. They hired the architect of Apple's retail store strategy, George Blankenship. And he really invented the retail aspect of Apple, which is, of course, now legendary. But for him, it was kind of, okay, been there, done that. This is an opportunity to make a difference on so many more levels than I could at Apple. Not that we don't love Apple, and we love everything they've done it has done for our lives. But there's, you can do. When you are changing the world, when you're decreasing the carbon load of transportation, when you're tackling global warming, when you're filling up a plant with your car manufacturing that had been shuttered a few years earlier and 5,000 people had lost their jobs, that just appeals on so many more levels to the entrepreneurial mindset than the traditional one. And so I think that is what we seek to capture. And we are able to hire rock stars into these companies because they really have an innate desire to make a lasting imprint on the world and society, and not just in business.
Julius, from MIT, do you see that same attitude occurring in large companies? I mean, we had a reference to is Nokia, having great social impact, and arguably by putting cheap mobile phones in the hands of everybody in the developing economies, they're having a massive impact because all the mobile creation is unleashed. But actually, in the large corporations themselves, is this attitude there that we're seeing in the smaller companies?
Definitely, but let me take it a little deeper. Social entrepreneurship is passion without the bottom line. Okay, that's what social entrepreneurs do. That's why they are called social entrepreneurs. And in big corporations, what we have seen and what I've experienced personally is the fact that there's innovation, there's technology. Technology is taking us to areas we have never seen before. And you are seeing big corporations that now realize, especially, most recently, that this whole world is kind of interconnected. We have a big nervous system of the world. And in terms of building wealth for a better world, everybody is now thinking, if I don't bring up the people that are lower, I'm not going to be there all by myself, or else it's going to be too lonely. So, what they are now saying is, you take somebody like Nokia, where or let me even use a competitor of Nokia, which I'm sure is actually a better example in my mind that I'm familiar with, Motorola, now Google. Now, so a couple of years ago in the Media Lab, Motorola, jointly with some of our researchers, came up with electronic ink. Most of you probably are familiar with that. E-ink was invented in the lab, and it became, a whole world phenomenon. But Motorola saw it earlier than anybody else. They took e-ink out, and they actually built affordable devices in India, and they deployed it. So it became far more accessible. Now, we all know the ripple effect of the mobile device. It's very contagious. And now people from the middle of nowhere can call, they can afford it, and they can do all of these things. As a matter of fact, one of the research we did was for every 10% increase in subscription in any country, it impacts your GDP roughly by 1%. That's a huge amount. So we are seeing a lot of that, and we are seeing a lot of companies that are much more passionate about, how do we build a better world? And building a better world is building social entrepreneurship. But I still go back to my original point, which is, all of these things, the mindset is there. And the problem we are having is, how do we, and to Iwaya's point, how do we measure this? How do we make this more effective so we can all be happy to see an end result that is desired? And the current end result is not sustainable, as I mentioned before. So we have to find a way to be able to say, okay, if I'm doing all of these things, here is how I measure it, here is how I get that satisfaction. That social entrepreneur that wants, that is passionate about what he's doing, who wants to be at the back of Time magazine or whatever, he wants to have something to show for it. Okay, so, how do you measure that? And I believe that's why we are all here. We can measure that. Measurement or currency is a relativity issue. I'm not saying it's going to be easy, but yes, we can measure it. I believe, if we start creating standards that says, okay, relatively, we are going to put a weight on so. When you do so much, I think impacts employment or quality of life or whatever it may be, we can start putting some quantitative measures to that we can now use to either draw the balance sheet, the profitability, maybe even trade the currency, if you want, in future.
Gary, are you finding that your donors are demanding that sort of greater accountability than they did in the past? And are you, in turn, passing that on to the recipients?
I would say pretty mixed, and I would do a gender divide on how our male donors are versus our female donors. I think our male donors will often lead with ROI. That's their first primary reason for investing. And I think just because women are wired a little bit differently, people and planet might come a little before profit in terms of the way most of our folks are thinking. I work primarily as a philanthropic coach and an advisor to high net worth individuals. And I think the dominant question in terms of by the time people find their way to me is they're interested in making a difference in the world, and they want their philanthropic handprint to be longstanding. And the value in terms of how they see their lives shifts and changes as people get older. And since the kind of massive intergenerational transfer of wealth that was supposed to happen during my generation hasn't really happened the way people thought it would really happen, and spend out in other ways of working with philanthropic capital are really shifting and changing the grant seeker, grant maker paradigm. I think the next generation is kind of wondering, especially if they're not on the inheritance side of the money that they thought was coming to them. There are a lot of questions in terms of, I'd say, families of wealth they're really dealing with right now.
Having to get a job.
Little things like that, yeah.
No, I'm waiting for the upward transference of generational transfers of wealth from my sons to me, but I'll be waiting a long time for that. Lila, do you consider yourself, I mean, given what we've been saying about the shift in attitudes, I mean, do you consider yourself a business that you're running, or is it really something substantively different?
I, like many people here, was inspired by Muhammad Yunus and his idea of social business. And he defines social business as a non-loss, so, operating at a positive cash flow from earned income, non-loss, non-dividend company. And I'm sure Nancy would disagree with this.
No, I think there's room for all.
Really?
I'm just in my world, my investors want a market rate return, but I think what you're doing is fabulous and that there's something for everyone. That's part of the beauty of this field.
So it's a really interesting question. I mean, to get back to Aishwarya's point about Adam Smith, ideally we wouldn't have to put the word social before enterprise. All enterprise should ideally, create value in the world, right? And profit should be tightly correlated to value. I don't know if anybody read Joe Stiglitz's new book. He's a former chief economist of the World Bank. He's at NYU, and he's wrote a fabulous new book called The Price of Inequality, which is deeply scary, which talks about income inequality in the US, which has now grown to a level that we have not seen since the 1920s. We're literally in like the robber baron era again when it comes to income distribution. And part of why he describes it that it's deeply scary is that it creates a market failure where profits are not necessarily correlated to social value. Again, in an ideal world, you shouldn't have to have the two be so separate. And I guess Julius's point is that, we're seeking a more integrated approach where the people who receive the highest rewards from capital markets are those people who've created the most value. And in some cases, that's really evident, right? I think companies like Nokia, a lot of the technology companies, it's no question that they've made everybody's lives better. And I think in other cases, we've had some deep questions about the role of, the finance world in the last financial crisis, and whether or not all of the profits that accrued to that world were really, were really tightly correlated to value. So I'd say that we're beyond business in the very traditional narrow sense of business as being about maximizing profit. I certainly, outsourcing for anybody who's ever spent any time in the industry is probably the least sexy field you can imagine. I mean, I would not want to wish that on anyone unless there was something more to it, right? I certainly wouldn't have quit my job to start an outsourcing company unless it had at its core something bigger than that, which is fighting poverty. And I just want to say one more thing about income inequality. I spent a lot of time looking at labor statistics, and it's, as I mentioned, a bit depressing. So there are about 3 billion people in the world who are in the labor market. And of that 3 billion, fully 1/3 of them, 976 million people, work a full-time job and still make under $2 a day. And that's adjusted for purchasing power. So those are 2005 US dollars. Imagine walking around Manhattan with $2 in your pocket and getting by on the whole day with that. And that's what 1 billion, 1/3 of the working poor, or of the working people around the world make. So it's kind of shocking. And I think in that sort of a world, we really do have to force ourselves to question whether the traditional model of capitalism, as we've narrowly defined it right now, is really the best model to achieve some of the value that we want to create. So I'll stop here.
Aishwarya, you talked a lot about measurement problems or the methodological difficulties. What needs to be done to resolve those, and what sort of feedback do you get, particularly from social entrepreneurs, about what those benchmarks should be?
Sure. Maybe it'll be useful to have an example. So I'll take an example that you mentioned. So microcredit has been one of the poster children of what it means to do business, to earn high returns, and at the same time serve a very an unmet need among poor families. So initially, I think for the initial 20 years or so, most of microcredit reported stats on why it was such an important innovation and such an important social business were around traditional market figures, like
take-up of the service, which was dramatically high, very high demand for the service, and usage of the service. So, cycle after cycle, how many people stick on with the service, use it for various kinds of investments, etc. And those two things, in my mind, are still very traditionally sort of business metrics of, take-up, usage as revenue, so those metrics. But more recently, we actually had the first randomized controlled trial measurement of a microcredit program in urban Hyderabad, in the slums of urban Hyderabad, where it was a randomized expansion of new credit, and we were looking at the impacts, accounting for things like spillovers at the slum level. And this was a paper that Esther Duflo and Abhijit Banerjee, who have a wonderful book called Poor Economics, they're both at MIT and with the Poverty Action Lab there. So the study basically finds that if you think about take-up, usage, and the next level as being welfare impact, they are measuring welfare impacts now, aside from who takes it up. And the one interesting thing about doing it in this fashion is they find a much more sobering result than what you would get from just measuring take-up and usage. So what you find is something so nuanced that it will not get too much PR because it's too nuanced, and that's the point of how do you sell science, I guess, at some level. But what it differs. The impact of accessing microcredit varies. It does not save the world. For certain people who are predisposed, measured at baseline to be predisposed to be entrepreneurial, what they tend to do is they cut down certain kinds of consumption, especially temptation goods like cigarettes and tea. In India, tea is a temptation good because you drink so much chai. But you cut down on that a little bit, so you see measured decreases in consumption at the family level of these particular kinds of goods, and increased sort of topping up of your loan with additional capital from your savings to invest in your business for people who have this predisposition to enterprise. For those who do not, they in fact invest the loan in consumption, which then makes it difficult to pay back when the loan officer comes by. And this is, what you would observe in your life. There are some people whom you would put your money on. Some people that they're not going to invest in an enterprise that will grow. And so that is part of the nuance of how you measure social impact. And I think one of the downsides of believing so much in a dream without measuring is that it can lead to really grave crises. I don't know if people followed the microcredit crisis of last year. It was especially stark in India, where we had a massive default. It was a little politicized as well, but massive default as a result of a few people's suicides being linked to their over-indebtedness as a result of aggressive lending by microcredit agencies. And some of these microcredit agencies had also gone to the point of offering an IPO, which made a fair amount of money for the shareholders involved. So it is a murky sort of territory when you're explicitly saying I have social impact goals, but at the same time I am trying to make money to sustain my business over time, in a certain fashion. But this is the kind of range of measurement. I'd say take-up, usage, and welfare measures.
Can I just make a comment on metrics? Because when you're in the impact field, everyone always brings up metrics. And we as a firm are committed to counting our jobs, counting how many are low income, counting where our companies are located and whether they're improving the neighborhoods where poverty exists. So we have a pretty extensive metrics effort, and many of our investors really appreciate that. But I think that there's a risk in being too hard on ourselves with the focus on metrics, because it is a fairly new evolving field. And I'll just give you one example. This Revolution Foods, which is the company that's serving healthy meals to low-income schools and is now doing it all over the country, 160,000 meals a day. When we first invested in that company and got some foundation people to help us support the company, there were folks out there, and just remember what the statistics are. This is the first generation where there's going to be more diabetes than in kids than there has been ever. That obesity, of course, is an epidemic in our country. You go into a school, you get hamburgers and French fries, and there's a vending machine with Coke and Pepsi. I mean, it's just a horrific environment. But we literally had people saying, well, we're not sure that if you swap out all that junk and give them whole wheat pizza and grapes and milk, we'd really have to do a longitudinal study and really not make a conclusion that that was useful for 30 years to see what they were eating when they were adults. And this is sort of the paralysis of metrics, because anyone knows that if whether you're a parent or you're around young children, that if you substitute healthy food at the younger ages and build habits from the get-go and do family support, you're going to have more of a chance of impacting behavior than our current modality. So while metrics can be a wonderful thing, it shouldn't strangle the innovative ideas that people have and that have a certain modicum of common sense.
Just one quick response to Nancy's comment. I absolutely agree, and I think there is always a risk of over-measurement, which we should be wary of. But I think what I'd say is looking to evidence. And the evidence you can draw from the pre-existing state of knowledge, from any field of science, or in cases where there is uncertainty on what the impact of a certain thing is, then it is our responsibility to measure it before evangelizing it. So I think, for example, nutrition is a science that has wonderfully documented studies, which have done this kind of rigorous assessment of what foods are good and what foods are not. And we draw on that evidence when we promote these kinds of businesses without waiting for 20-year outcomes. But not so in the financial sector. We do not have these kinds of measures even in the existing developing, like the developed world. And so it is, I think, a responsibility to measure them fairly carefully, especially when they have such dramatic welfare consequences.
Nancy, your comments have brought up another point, which is if you're looking at the impacts on welfare outcomes, there are so many other variables involved there. Big things, health, education, things which are probably, if not in the aggregate, certainly at the micro level, beyond the scope of individual enterprises really to affect, without becoming far more deeply involved in public policy. And I know this is something the Gates Foundation says a lot, that they are now spending as much of their time talking to governments as actually being out in the field and doing the work. So I know this is a question for Roland or Julius or anyone who'd like to pick it up, but is the social enterprise movement going to have inevitably to move more into the political arena? And if it does that, do you then not loop back into the sovereignty problem?
I want to hear from others. I'll just say we spend a huge amount of our time in public policy because it is so fundamental. In the case of nutrition, the Child Nutrition Act that was passed 2 years ago, we fought to increase the amount that the government reimburses for school lunches, which is a pathetic, from $2.63, I think, to $2.75 a lunch. It's very hard to make a nutritious lunch because at that price point, because sugar and kind of unhealthy food elements are subsidized in this country. So you automatically get into public policy, you fight the fight, you get your management teams to get in there because that really becomes part of your competitive advantage.
Roland, why don't you make a final comment, and then maybe we should open up the floor if we can get the microphones prepared.
I think Nancy said something very wise, and that is everybody has a role in these processes. And I'm not an anarchist. Governments have a role as well. I spent many, many years in government, and public policy is a very important aspect of all this. But we need to think of the solutions in multi-stakeholder contexts. We need to realize that lots of different groups have different comparative advantages, and we have to find a way to complement these comparative advantages to deliver the sort of results we want. And governments have a very important role in all that. But I want to go back to a word I used previously, the word empowerment, and we were using it in terms of employment and jobs and economic empowerment, but you can't avoid political empowerment. You can't have economic empowerment without political empowerment, and I think we're going to find that lesson in China in the next 10 years. People will simply not accept to be independent economic actors, but have no political role in life. People want to have a political role, and of course my other hat, apart from the partnership hat, is I run the UN Democracy Fund, and that's what ultimately, that's the word we need to use. It's democracy that does give that political empowerment across the board, and it's as vital to these sort of outcomes as the economic empowerment.
I'd love to add one comment there, which is the way that I see government evolving. And it's interesting because USAID has announced recently that it's going to be doing a lot more direct funding of NGOs in country than of governments or large development institutions, which is a fascinating shift. I mean, we've seen it in the last 5 years in the aid sector. I fundamentally think that government should evolve into being more of a social investor that analyzes on our behalf social return. And when that link is incredibly clear, you have fewer of the feedback problems that I alluded to earlier and more pride of ownership in taxpayers. I remember recently seeing on the tarmac in DC one of our old spacecraft that had just been transported to DC from Florida, and the pilot took a special detour so that everybody on the plane could see it, and people were like applauding, and it was this incredible moment because I haven't felt it recently, just given the cynicism we all have in government and its ability to spend our money effectively. But I did feel like at some point, you know, there was a real pride in paying taxes, and people said, wow, my taxpayer dollars built that thing that got launched into space, and we were like the envy of the world for doing that, and isn't that amazing? And I think that the only way to capture that back is to show through all sorts of, now we have all sorts of great ways to collect data, but to show transparently the social return on that taxpayer investment. And I think we've been able to do it especially well in the sciences. I think about, you know, the way the internet was formed, that was government-funded research, right? We haven't done it as well in the social sector. And I do think that there's a powerful role for government to play as an investor that identifies great social enterprise models and funds those independent entrepreneurs to generate better returns than might be generated by a government-run program. But I do think that government plays a role in the sense of, you know, collecting the capital and making sure that that capital gets to the right innovators.
It's interesting that one of the themes that's emerged in several of the panels over the last day and a half is how, along with the reinvention and the evolution of business models and societal models, we also need to evolve government models as well, because clearly government is stuck in a past that is no longer matching the reality of the economic present. So some questions. We'll start there, and then we'll go to the front row after that.
Hi, my name's Chris. I'm part of a social venture product design firm in China. In the world right now, I'm sure the panel would agree, a lot of this social enterprise, social venture stuff has a lot of buzz. It's all over the press, it's all over higher education. There's probably 10 panels just like this one, you know, happening around the world, which fundamentally is a good thing, but it means there's a lot of noise. So I'm interested if some of the panelists could maybe give a specific example of, from the entrepreneur perspective, what about a funder or a partner really cut through the chaff to say, yes, that's someone I want to be funded by, that's somebody I want to partner with, or on the funder partner maker side, to find the venture, the entrepreneur, the whatever, to say, that's what I want to support, that's where I want my money to go, specifically.
Gary, do you want to start us off on that?
Yeah, I would say that in the investors, donors that I work with, many of them are looking for establishing mutually beneficial relationships around their grant making or around their investments. So what that means to me is valuing the investee as much as they value their gift to the investee, and seeing their cash or whatever donation they're making to a social enterprise is being in symmetry with what they're getting on the other side. Now, that's so wide-ranging in terms of what each individual donor is called to do in their life. If what you're being called to do is to save indigenous languages, and you're going to invest in elders who carry indigenous languages and are the last speakers in their tribe, and you're doing all that you can to support them, the currency that you're getting back is this indigenous culture will be intact, and everything that's part of the fabric of that culture will be intact. Not every donor is interested in that kind of an ROI. And I think as somebody who works pretty closely with people who have such a wide range of passions in their lives, you know, my work is to individualize each donor, each investor, to say, and it really fundamentally comes down to is, you know, say you're in a hospice and you have to, this is your legacy. You know, treat your life like you're in hospice and make some decisions about what you want to see happen in the world. And I think that approach versus the approach of hoarding money and resources, which tends to happen with high net worth people, is, how much is enough in terms of before you start becoming philanthropic? Is $1 billion enough? I worked with a donor who, when he first approached me, he had just made his first $1 billion, and he was 70 years old and was ready to start being philanthropic, and he was dead by the time he was 72. And his money is still, being argued about with various members of his family. So he missed out because he didn't realize what he could have done with $100 million in capital that could have been infused into a lot of communities around the world. He waited that long. And it's almost like that reality series Hoarders. It reminds me of is, how much is enough? And I think wealth has kind of reached that place that people, and sometimes the dysfunction associated with families and how they work with their wealth is a part of that. But it's also, it's really about, what's the legacy that you want to have happen during your lifetime that you can actually see tangible returns from.
There's a question in the front. So the lesson of that is give early and die late.
By the way, $75,000 is apparently the number in the
is that
U.S.
the
That's what
number?
the New York Times, there's a New York Times article about it, and all the happiness research shows that that's enough.
Well, and what a lot of families are doing, as opposed to your gentleman, which is unfortunate, is they're using social investing to get their kids interested in their inheritance, because a lot of for those that do have the wealth to transfer, a lot of the parents are having difficulty getting their kids really into it because they see it as boring or just too old. But when you go in and you say, hey, I'm investing in Tesla or Pandora, I'm investing stuff that you really think is cool, it's kind of a nice way to bring them into accepting the responsibility that they have as wealth is
I want
passed
to
on.
thank the panel. This has been really fantastic. My name is Robin Smalley. I'm a founder of an NGO called Mothers to Mothers. We're based in South Africa. And I was really struck, Roland, by how you initially started the panel. We've been able to scale up really quickly because of our strong partnerships with other NGOs, with local implementing partners, with the UN agencies, and with the private sector. And I'm actually seeing kind of the opposite of what you just talked a little bit about, because we are partners with UNAIDS, and they're in the global plan to end pediatric AIDS by 2015 and keep mothers alive. And since that was released a little over a year ago, I've seen a swing now towards more support of direct government funding among PEPFAR and USAID. And I am wondering, I'm really supporting what you say, and I'm concerned because I'm seeing a backswing because of the right concern on health system strengthening and capacity development and long-term sustainability. We all want to see local governments and taking the reins, but now it's happening so quickly without any transitional period to make sure it's done correctly, to make sure governments are actually measuring impact and looking at the matrices that need to be used. And I'm very concerned that we're going to backslide. And so I'm wondering, with your idea, you say a lot of people don't support it, but I'm concerned truly that a lot of people don't support it.
Well, Robin, I think the world took a backward step for for what looked like a very good reason. And that was the Paris Principles of aid effectiveness back 10, 12 years ago. And basically, the Paris Principles privileged governments. The Paris Principles basically privileged receiving governments and marginalized other forces. And it's now taken, the Accra meeting and now in Busan to bring civil society back into this sort of an equation. And look, I think governments are naturally statist in the way they want to do things. They naturally want to deal with other governments. It's the logic of public money, is that it wants to deal with public officials and so forth. One of the reasons that development assistance has not actually helped economic development is that the logic of public money is we can't help somebody make a profit. That's not what public money does. It can You know, so whenever you see these sort of aid projects to help business, it's actually helping governments draft bankruptcy laws. That's the, you know, it's the infrastructure around it. But I think things are changing. And the Busan meeting was an important point in that regard to deal civil society back in. I'm surprised if PEPFAR is going more status, because it's been one of the model programs in Africa, and I think USAID is moving much more towards funding civil society. And here's the newest challenge that we really need to watch out for. What we can't do is have governments fund their own civil society to get on aeroplanes and go to Africa like the missionaries used to do and deliver aid. And we've got to fund local civil society. And there may be cases where we do need civil society from the north to facilitate and to teach and so forth, but the business model should be, let's fund local civil society, not their governments.
Let me just add one comment to that, if I may. I think that's, I agree with what Roland just said, absolutely. But something to keep in mind, though, you want the government to be somewhat involved, because you cannot teach somebody who doesn't know by eliminating him, if you get my logic. So if we believe they are not doing the right thing, we have to show them how to do the right thing. We have to let them know that there has to be a return on social capital. And when we teach them that, hopefully, they'll be able to do that. And actually, just FYI, we both, from MIT point of view, we are partnering with UCT in Cape Town. I was just there 2 weeks ago. There's a new social entrepreneurship center that has been set up that we are helping them to do. So maybe that will help you.
I think we've got time for one more question before I ask the panel to conclude it by just giving us a one-sentence, each go down the line and give a one-sentence takeaway from this session about what we've been discussing, so you're prepared. There was a question over there, so if we could, you got the microphone? Perfect, okay.
My name's Courtney Page. I'm a graduate student at the Whitehead School of Diplomacy at Seton Hall. I spend a lot of my time studying disaster management, and I find that the private sector contribution to be very interesting. So this is really for all of you. How do you think organizations are promoting welfare improvement in countries recovering from a natural or man-made disaster? Where do you see strengths as well as opportunities for private firms? And is there an ideal response and results private firms should seek after in the wake of a disaster?
I'll take that one.
Laila, you want to start there?
I have a story for you. So in 2010, in the very early part of the year, we were in the final stages of accepting a partner in Haiti, a computer lab in Haiti where workers would come in and do outsourced work for SamaSource. And then the earthquake happened right after, the day after we accepted our first partner. And so immediately, we called the center and we said, oh my God, this is so terrible. Obviously, work is not your primary concern right now. What can we send over and how can we help you? They were in the Central Plateau, which is about 2 hours outside of Port-au-Prince. We got a response back and they said, actually, we need jobs more than we need anything else. And every surrounding community around Port-au-Prince was seeing this influx of refugees, people who lost their livelihoods. And so interestingly, the #1 need in Haiti following the earthquake was jobs. In fact, we did a really interesting contract funded by the State Department that was like a text message-based 911 system, so people would send in a text to an emergency helpline. We had SamaSource workers on the ground translate it into English, and then it was routed to a local aid worker who could respond in real time, and the whole loop took like 10 minutes. And so we collected the data, and the top request, more than water or food or sanitation, was jobs. So this was really interesting news for us, and what we found in the wake of the disaster is that often that's overlooked, that people's fundamental source of livelihood is overlooked. So we do this emergency assistance, we provide food and water and all that other stuff, we build tent cities, but we neglect to think about the underlying cause of future suffering, which will be lack of economic opportunities for local people. So I've actually seen a really positive movement. There's been a huge business shift towards Haiti. A lot of organizations are thinking about how they can source ethically from local artisans, and a lot of that's happened as a result of CGI and the things that are happening around that. So I think that's the best role for business to play.
And
Adam
can
Smith will be-
can I just add that there's...
Very quickly, because time really is
Well,
pressing.
just
on us.
there are domestic examples too. You look at the state of Mississippi that was devastated by Katrina. The former governor there, Haley Barbour, knew he had to do something to reconstruct the economy. He decided to give low-interest loans, $40 million loans that you don't have to pay off for many, many years, to clean tech companies to attract them into Mississippi, to create jobs and to diversify the employment. He put a whole bunch of workforce training in, and he got companies that were in Silicon Valley to manufacture in Mississippi, and now those people that lost their many of them who had lost their livelihood post-Katrina or post-Gulf oil spill, are now finding new sources of employment. So jobs is the key.
Okay, the streamer of destiny really is fast approaching the sleeping toad of time, so let's just conclude with one sentence strategic takeaway for the audience from this discussion. Let's start with you, Ashwara, if you would.
Well, something that I've learned from the other panelists is maybe to think a little bit more about complementarities between what the private sector does and the government, and who has strategic advantage for what kinds of investments for poverty alleviation.
Lila?
I guess my sentence is that social enterprise can correct for market failure.
And I would say that we have significant problems to solve on a global basis. That's the bad news. The good news is that we have almost an infinite source of entrepreneurial drive that is increasingly caring about the social problems and solving them, as well as business innovation. So I'm optimistic.
Gary?
I would say high net worth individuals and families are not ATM machines. They're people wanting to see change happen in the world, and take advantage of the fact that it takes a certain amount of moral courage to put your money, your hard-earned money, into, especially with social enterprises that are in a startup stage. So moral courage is kind of the phrase I'd leave with.
Julius?
I think there's a lot of passion in the world to reduce the disparity of wealth. People are passionate about doing things. We are at the age of technology, where technology allows us to be able to do that. What I'm concerned with is we still need to get back to some level of being able to measure the result in terms of return on social capital. And we have to make that a standard that we start thinking about.
Roland, the first and the last word.
Thank you. Well, issues of change and development are ultimately political. And that's the base on which all this is built. And the final word I'd give is, though it's a messy, unsatisfactory system, we've still got to build democracies around the world.
Thank you. I think it's been a fascinating conversation, and I would just ask you to thank your panelists on your behalf for their contribution.